Hello and welcome back. Great to be with you all today. This is a follow-up of our last session for the lease versus purchase option. How would you decide? And we're going to use a second method of determining this. I'm your host, Brian Shakarami, and let's get started. In our last session, we covered the decision-making process of lease versus buy or purchase through the net present value method. Today, we'll cover the same process using the internal rate of return method, but the internal rate of return of the differential. That is the difference between buying and leasing. So back to square one. Should I buy it or should I lease it? That is certainly a real life question, a real life issue. And again, I'm not trying to sound like an attorney or an accountant, but it really depends. And we will shortly cover what it depends on. Mind you, everything that we do here is strictly from a financial perspective, not a geographic or political or zoning or anything else. This is strictly looking at things from a financial perspective. So in this segment, we will look at the IRR of the differential, which is the internal rate of return of the differential. Remember that there are two methods of determining this. One is the net present value method, which we did in our last session. And the second method of determining whether to purchase or lease is through the IRR of the differential, or the internal rate of return of the differential. And like anything else, any good analysis must start with the cash flow. So we will start with a cash flow analysis. So far, the first two portions of this is exactly like the last episode that we had or the last session that we had. Meaning, we determine the cost of owning by putting the initial investment down, followed by all the cash flows from years 1 through N, followed by the sales proceed in the final year. And on the right side here is the cost of leasing, which is basically the cost of leasing from years 1 through N minus their associated tax savings. And that depended on the tax bracket. So at the beginning, I did say that this is the cash flow of the differential. And when I say differential, then I'm looking for a difference. And the difference is basically the difference between the cost of owning and the cost of leasing. So we had the cost of owning as previously depicted and as discussed. And we have the cost of leasing. So we subtract the cost of leasing from the cost of owning to come up with the differential cost. And once we have the differential cost, we have a beginning and we have an end, so therefore we can come up with an internal rate of return. It's the internal rate of return of this difference that we will compare against either our discount rate or weighted average cost of capital. And the way that works is actually very simple. If the internal rate of return is greater than the discount rate that you get from a bank or your weighted average cost of capital, then you go with owning the building. If your internal rate of return is less than your discount rate that you get from a bank or your weighted average cost of capital, then you go with leasing. Let's simplify that. If by owning the building I get more in return than what the bank can give me, then I will own it. And conversely, if my rate of return for owning the building is going to be less than what the bank gives me, then it is not worth for me to own it. I should be leasing it. So the best way to drive our point home is through an example. As before, we go back to Trump Plaza. This is the same example that we used previously with the net present value method. And the answer should still come out the same, whether you use the net present value method or the internal rate of return of the differential. So in our example, Donald Trump is looking at a commercial building, quote unquote, Trump Plaza, pondering whether it would financially make more sense to lease it or to purchase it. The whole time, if he were to acquire the building, would be 20 years. He would also lease it for 20 years if that was his go-to decision. There's no financing involved, so this is very simple and clean. Using the IRR of the differential method, what is your recommendation to Mr. Trump? Easy enough. The scenario is the same. Building size over here, 40,000 square foot, holding period, 20 years, purchase price, acquisition cost, improvement allocation of 80%, which means 20% is allocated to the land. And this 80% is used for cost recovery recapture, using a useful life of 39 years. The annual growth rate is provided here, which we use to calculate the disposition price in 20 years. And projected cost of sale at disposition is also noted. The tax bracket and discount rates are denoted below. And the lease information is provided exactly like the last example, identical. Lease term 20 years. And that would be our holding period if we were to own it for 20 years. Remember, you have to compare apples and apples. And here, notice that there's a rent escalation from year 1 to year 5. The rate is constant. From year 6 to 10, there's a $3 bump, or actually it's a $2 bump, an escalation in rent. From year 11 to 15, there is a $3 bump or escalation in rent. And from years 16 to 20, there's another $2 bump or escalation in rent. So the setup is almost like the net present value method. So what do I mean by that? If you look at the lease costs, same as what we did with the net present value method, we have all the cash flows before tax, and we subtract the tax savings, and therefore we come up with the cash flow after tax. In our previous example, this is how we came up with the net present value method. But this is not what we're going to do. We're going to keep basically this last column, which is the cash flow after tax. We then move to the purchase cost, and again, like the last example of using the net present value method, we have an initial investment followed by the cash flows for 20 years, followed by the disposition sale price. In our last example, we did the net present value, not what we're going to do here. And so the next slide will provide you what we will do. As I mentioned, this is cash flow of the differential. It means the cash flow of the difference of leasing and owning. So we have the ownership cash flow as we had it depicted in the last slide, and we have the leasing cash flow, and we subtract the lease from the buy or the ownership. And lo and behold, we have the differential or the difference of the two in the right column. From here, it's very easy to crank in the numbers and come up with the internal rate of return of 5.16% in this case. Now, what do we do with this number? Or what does this number tell us? Remember that we said this number must be compared to either the discount rate that the bank is providing us or our weighted average cost of capital. In this case, our weighted average cost of capital or discount rate was 6%. However, our internal rate of return was 5.16%, which means our internal rate of return of the differential is less than the weighted average cost of capital or our discount rate. This means effectively that we make more money by not keeping our capital or our money in the building. Therefore, it's better to lease. So as we mentioned before, if the internal rate of return of the differential is less than the weighted average cost of capital or discount rate, then we go with leasing. And it makes sense. However, if this internal rate of return was like 6.5%, then our money in our building would make more money than if we were to borrow from a bank, or if the discount rate was 6%, or if our weighted average cost of capital was 6%. Being that our internal rate of return is less than the discount rate, we will make the decision to go with leasing option. So what you would notice is the answer is the same. The conclusion is the same as our previous example, which was the same example, but using the net present value method. Hopefully the method is not going to change the answer or your conclusion. And in this case, it did not. So in summary, what we just covered was the internal rate of return of the differential method to decide whether we should purchase or lease a building. As always, if you have any questions regarding what we just discussed, please send me an email to the following address and I'll be happy to get back to you. Thank you for your time.